That Friday afternoon in November changed everything. I'll never forget sitting in that sterile HR office, watching Linda shuffle through papers that contained lies about me. Lies so carefully crafted they sounded like truth. Tyler had taken everything I'd taught him, every mistake I'd covered for him, every moment of trust I'd given him, and turned it all into a weapon pointed straight at my heart. When she read his complaints out loud, saying I couldn't handle pressure, that I was difficult to work with, that I became emotional during team collaborations, I felt my hands start to shake. 6 years of dedication, of staying late, of building relationships and solving problems, reduced to a manila folder full of manufactured evidence. The worst part wasn't even the lies themselves. It was realizing that Tyler had been planning this for months, maybe from the very beginning. Every late-night phone call where I'd patiently explained procedures, every time I'd defended him in meetings, every moment I'd believed we were building something together as partners, he'd been documenting it all, twisting my kindness into proof of my instability. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to make them see what he'd really done. But sitting there in that cold office, I knew the game was already over. Tyler had won before I'd even realized we were playing. And what came after that meeting was so much worse than I could have imagined. The first time I saw Tyler walk into our office at the insurance company in downtown Phoenix, I thought he looked like someone who'd actually get things done. Not like the usual crowd who shuffled papers around and called it productivity. He had this confidence about him, the way he shook hands with everyone, asked genuine questions about the workflow, even remembered the receptionist's name by the end of his first week. I was the senior claims processor then, had been there for 6 years, and I'd seen plenty of new hires come and go. But Tyler was different. He actually listened when I explained our system, took notes, asked follow-up questions that showed he was really trying to understand the business. Within a month, we were staying late together, going over complex cases, and I found myself looking forward to Monday mornings for the first time in years. The trust between us felt natural, professional, built on shared dedication to getting the job done right. When our supervisor Janet assigned us to work together on the Morrison account, a massive commercial claim that could make or break our quarterly numbers, I knew we made a solid team. Tyler had this way of breaking down complicated problems into manageable pieces, and I had the institutional knowledge to navigate the company's bureaucracy. We'd grab coffee from the diner across the street every morning before diving into the files, and he'd always insist on paying, saying it was the least he could do since I was teaching him the ropes. Those conversations over burnt coffee and stale donuts became the foundation of what I thought was genuine partnership. He'd tell me about his struggles with his previous job, how he'd been overlooked for promotions, how he was determined to prove himself here. I shared my own frustrations about being pigeonholed as just a processor when I knew I had management potential. We had this understanding, this mutual respect that felt rare in corporate America. The first real test of our partnership came when Tyler made a critical error on the Henderson file, a mistake that could have cost the company $50,000. He'd miscalculated the depreciation on damaged equipment, essentially approving a payout that was twice what it should have been. I caught it during my review, just hours before it was supposed to go to Janet for final approval. My heart sank when I realized what had happened, not because of the mistake itself, but because I knew how devastating this could be for Tyler's career. He was still in his probationary period, and Janet had already expressed concerns about some of his other work. I could have simply corrected the file and moved on, but Tyler was panicking, convinced he was about to be fired. The way his hands shook as he stared at his computer screen, the defeat in his voice when he said he couldn't afford to lose another job. Something inside me just couldn't let him fail like that. I spent the entire weekend reconstructing the Henderson file from scratch, creating a paper trail that would show the error as a system glitch, rather than human mistake. I came in early Monday morning and submitted the corrected version, with a memo explaining the supposed technical issue that had caused the miscalculation. When Janet praised our team for catching and resolving the problem so efficiently, Tyler looked at me with such gratitude that I felt like I'd done something truly meaningful. He pulled me aside after the meeting and said I'd saved his career, that he'd never forget what I'd done for him. The way he said it, with such sincerity, made me believe I'd gained not just a colleague, but a real ally. I told him anyone would have done the same thing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I'd risked my own reputation to protect his, and I'd done it because I believed in him, believed in us as a team. The calls started coming about 3 weeks later, always after hours, always when Tyler was facing some kind of deadline pressure. He'd phone my cell around 8 or 9 at night, his voice stressed but grateful, explaining whatever crisis had come up that day. Could I help him understand the liability calculations on the Peterson case? Did I remember how we'd handled that unusual claim structure last month? Could I walk him through the compliance requirements for out-of-state claims? Each conversation would stretch for an hour or more, with me patiently explaining procedures I'd mastered years ago, while Tyler took detailed notes on the other end of the line. He always thanked me profusely, always said he was so lucky to have someone like me as a mentor and friend. Those words made me feel valued in a way I hadn't experienced in years at that company. Finally, someone recognized my expertise. Someone appreciated the knowledge I'd accumulated through years of grinding through claims files. What I didn't realize then was how carefully Tyler was building his case for advancement, while positioning me as his support system, rather than his equal. When the regional manager visited our office for quarterly reviews, Tyler made sure to mention how much he'd learned from me, how grateful he was for my guidance, how I'd been instrumental in helping him understand the company's systems. It sounded like praise, and Janet nodded approvingly as Tyler spoke, but something about the way he framed it made me feel smaller rather than elevated. He was the ambitious newcomer with fresh ideas and energy, while I was the helpful veteran who'd shown him the ropes. The dynamic he created cast me as his assistant rather than his partner, and I was too flattered by his attention to recognize the subtle repositioning that was taking place. I thought his success would lift both of us, that proving ourselves as an effective team would demonstrate my leadership potential and his capability. By the time Tyler had been with the company for 6 months, our relationship had evolved into something I mistook for deep professional trust. He'd become the person I defended in meetings when other colleagues questioned his methods or criticized his occasional shortcuts. When Janet expressed frustration about his tendency to miss deadlines, I'd explain that he was just being thorough, that quality work took time. When other processors complained that Tyler seemed to get preferential treatment, I'd point out how hard he worked and how much he'd improved since starting. I genuinely believed I was supporting someone who deserved it, someone who would remember my loyalty when he inevitably moved up in the company. The evening phone calls had become routine. His expressions of gratitude had become expected, and I'd settled into a role that felt important and necessary. I was Tyler's confidant, his mentor, his most reliable supporter, and I wore those titles like badges of honor, never suspecting that I was actually being groomed to be his safety net. The first crack in my confidence appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September, right there in the break room next to the ancient coffee machine that barely worked. I was waiting for my usual burnt brew when Tyler walked in with Derek from accounting, both of them laughing about some inside joke I wasn't part of. What struck me wasn't the laughter itself, but how Tyler's entire demeanor changed when he saw me. The easy smile vanished, replaced by that polite, professional mask I'd seen him wear with Janet during their formal meetings. He nodded at me, mumbled something about getting back to work, and walked out with Derek, leaving me standing there with an empty coffee mug and a knot in my stomach I couldn't quite explain. It was such a small moment, so insignificant that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But something had shifted. The warmth that had defined our interactions for months felt suddenly conditional, like it only existed when Tyler needed something from me. I started paying closer attention after that, noticing patterns I previously overlooked in my eagerness to maintain our partnership. When we were working together on files, Tyler remained the same engaged colleague I'd grown to trust. But in group settings, he seemed to create distance between us in ways that felt calculated. During team meetings, he'd position himself across the conference table instead of beside me, his body language formal and reserved. When other colleagues made jokes or shared stories, Tyler would join in enthusiastically, but when I contributed to the conversation, he'd offer only polite acknowledgement before redirecting attention elsewhere. The change was subtle enough that I questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was being oversensitive or reading too much into normal workplace interactions. But the feeling persisted, this growing sense that Tyler was managing his association with me, rather than simply enjoying our professional friendship. The Thursday afternoon incident crystallized my concerns in a way that made denial impossible. We were facing a deadline on the Rodriguez claim, a complex case involving multiple properties and overlapping coverage issues that required both of our expertise to resolve properly. I'd been working on the liability calculations since early morning, cross-referencing policy details and regulatory requirements to ensure our assessment was bulletproof. When Tyler arrived that afternoon with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, I felt a surge of the old warmth between us. We worked side by side for 3 hours, brainstorming solutions and building a comprehensive report that showcased both our analytical skills and our collaborative approach. The energy felt right again, like we were back to being genuine partners tackling challenging problems together. But when Janet stopped by to check on our progress, something shifted in Tyler's presentation of our work. Standing in front of Janet's desk with our completed report, Tyler began explaining our findings with the confidence of someone who'd single-handedly solved a complex puzzle. He walked through the liability analysis using phrases like, "I determined that," and "my assessment shows," while I stood beside him, nodding along like a supportive assistant. When Janet asked about the regulatory compliance section, which I'd spent hours researching and writing, Tyler smoothly claimed credit for identifying the key requirements. The most painful moment came when Janet complimented the thoroughness of the work, and Tyler responded with a humble smile, saying he'd really pushed himself to get everything right. I felt invisible standing there, my contributions erased by Tyler's careful reframing of our collaboration. When Janet left, Tyler turned to me with that familiar grateful smile and said we made a great team, apparently oblivious to how completely he'd minimized my role in front of our supervisor. The email exclusions started about a week later, small omissions that might have seemed accidental if they hadn't formed such a clear pattern. Tyler began sending status updates directly to Janet and the regional team without copying me, even on cases where I'd done significant portions of the work. When I asked him about it during one of our coffee runs, he apologized profusely, claiming he'd been rushing and had simply forgotten to include me on the distribution list. His explanation sounded reasonable, even sincere, but the pattern continued. Project updates, client communications, meeting summaries. I found myself learning about development secondhand, usually from colleagues who mentioned things in passing. The isolation was gradual but systematic, designed to position Tyler as the primary point of contact for our joint work, while relegating me to a supporting role that became increasingly invisible to upper management. The moment that should have been my wake-up call happened during the monthly staff meeting in October, when Janet was reviewing our team's performance metrics. She mentioned the success of several recent cases, specifically praising the innovative approach on the Rodriguez claim and the efficiency with which the Henderson file discrepancy had been resolved. As she spoke, Tyler nodded appreciatively, accepting the recognition as his due, while I sat there feeling like a ghost. These were cases where I'd done the majority of the analytical work, where my experience and institutional knowledge had been crucial to achieving positive outcomes. Yet Tyler had successfully positioned himself as the driving force behind these successes, and I was simply part of the background machinery that supported his efforts. When Janet asked Tyler to share his insights about effective case management with the newer staff members, I watched him present strategies and techniques I'd taught him, as if they were his own innovations. The realization hit me with devastating clarity as I sat in my car after that meeting, staring at the neon sign of the diner where Tyler and I had shared so many morning conversations. I wasn't Tyler's partner or even his mentor, I was his launching pad. Every piece of knowledge I'd shared, every connection I'd helped him make, every mistake I'd covered for him had been carefully catalogued and repurposed to build his reputation while diminishing mine. The late-night phone calls weren't desperate requests for help from a grateful colleague. They were strategic information-gathering sessions designed to harvest my expertise for his benefit. The trust I'd felt between us had been entirely one-sided, a professional intimacy I'd created in my own mind, while Tyler methodically extracted everything valuable from our relationship. Sitting there in the parking lot with the October sun setting behind the mountains, I finally understood that Tyler hadn't changed. I'd simply stopped being useful enough to warrant his full attention. The call came on a Friday afternoon in November, just as I was finishing up the weekly compliance reports and looking forward to a quiet weekend. My phone rang with an internal extension I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a cheerful voice introduced herself as Linda from Human Resources. She asked if I could come upstairs for a quick chat. Something about reviewing team dynamics and getting feedback on recent workflow changes. Her tone was casual, almost friendly, like we were going to discuss scheduling preferences or office supply needs. I told her I'd be right up, grabbed my jacket, and walked to the elevator feeling curious but not concerned. After 6 years with the company, I'd had maybe 3 interactions with HR, all routine stuff about benefits enrollment or policy updates. The idea that this conversation might be anything other than administrative never crossed my mind as I pressed the button for the 14th floor. Linda's office was one of those sterile corporate spaces designed to feel welcoming but ultimately impersonal. With motivational posters about teamwork and a small plant that looked like it was struggling to survive under fluorescent lights. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, her smile warm but professional, and I settled in expecting questions about process improvements or training needs. Instead, she opened a manila folder and said something that made my blood turn cold. She explained that the company had received some concerns about workplace behavior and wanted to get my perspective on recent team interactions. The way she said it, with that careful HR neutrality, made it clear this wasn't a routine feedback session. Someone had filed a complaint, and based on the questions that followed, that someone was Tyler. The first accusation hit me like a physical blow. Linda explained, in that same measured tone, that there had been reports of my difficulty handling work pressure, specifically instances where I'd become emotional or argumentative during team collaborations. She asked if I felt overwhelmed by my current workload, if I'd been experiencing any personal stress that might be affecting my professional behavior. The questions felt surreal, like she was describing someone I'd never met. I tried to respond calmly, explaining that I'd never had performance issues, that my reviews had always been positive, that I couldn't understand what she was referring to. But Linda just nodded and made notes, her expression neutral, as if my confusion was exactly what she'd expected. She asked about my relationship with Tyler specifically, whether I felt our working partnership had been successful, whether there had been any conflicts or disagreements I wanted to discuss. As Linda continued reading from her notes, a picture emerged that was so distorted from reality that I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. According to the complaint, I had been possessive about projects, resistant to feedback, and prone to emotional outbursts when challenged. Tyler had apparently documented several instances where I'd been unprofessional, including times when I'd taken credit for his work or undermined his contributions during meetings. The irony was so twisted it made me nauseous. Every behavior Tyler had exhibited toward me was being attributed to me, as if he'd held up a mirror and projected his own manipulative tactics onto my character. Linda asked if I recalled the incident with the Henderson file, where Tyler claimed I'd become defensive when he tried to point out errors in my calculations. The moment she said it, I understood how thoroughly I'd been set up. The most devastating part wasn't the false accusations themselves, but the methodical way Tyler had constructed his case against me. Linda showed me printed emails where Tyler had documented his concerns about my behavior, messages sent to his personal account that painted me as an increasingly difficult colleague who was becoming hostile toward his success. He'd taken our private conversations, our moments of professional vulnerability, and twisted them into evidence of my instability. The evening phone calls where I'd patiently explained procedures were reframed as desperate attempts to maintain control over his work. The times I'd covered for his mistakes were presented as manipulative efforts to make him dependent on me. Every kindness I'd shown, every piece of trust I'd offered, had been weaponized against me with surgical precision. Linda maintained her professional demeanor throughout the meeting, but I could see the judgment in her eyes as she reviewed Tyler's documentation. Here was a young, ambitious employee who'd taken the time to carefully record his concerns about a difficult colleague, someone who'd tried to work through problems before reluctantly bringing them to management's attention. The narrative Tyler had created cast him as the victim of my emotional instability and professional jealousy, a talented newcomer being sabotaged by a veteran employee who couldn't handle his success. When Linda asked if I had any documentation to support my version of events, I realized how naive I'd been. I'd never thought to protect myself from someone I trusted completely. I had no saved emails proving Tyler's mistakes, no records of my contributions to his successes, no evidence of the partnership I thought we'd shared. The meeting ended with Linda's assurance that this was just a preliminary discussion, that the company wanted to address any issues before they escalated further. She handed me a folder containing the employee handbook sections on professional conduct and conflict resolution, suggesting I review them over the weekend. As I walked back to the elevator, my hands shaking as I pressed the down button, I felt like I was seeing the office with new eyes. Colleagues who'd always been friendly now seemed to avoid eye contact. Conversations stopped when I approached, and I wondered how long Tyler had been building his case against me. The trust I'd placed in him hadn't just been betrayed. It had been systematically documented and turned into a weapon that could destroy everything I'd worked to build at this company. Standing in that elevator, watching the numbers count down to my floor, I finally understood that Tyler hadn't just taken credit for my work. He'd stolen my entire professional identity and used it to bury me. Walking back to my desk after that HR meeting felt like the longest journey of my professional life. Every step weighted with the knowledge that my colleagues might already know about Tyler's complaints. The office buzzed with its usual Friday afternoon energy, people wrapping up projects and making weekend plans, but I felt completely disconnected from that normal world. I sat down at my computer and stared at the screen, pretending to review files while my mind raced through every interaction I'd had with Tyler over the past 8 months. Had other people noticed his growing distance? Had they seen him undermining me in meetings? Were they already talking about the difficult woman who couldn't handle working with talented newcomers? The paranoia felt suffocating, but I forced myself to maintain a professional facade, responding to emails and finishing my reports as if nothing had changed. Monday morning brought the first real test of my ability to function normally in what had become a hostile environment. Tyler arrived at his usual time, coffee in hand, greeting everyone with his characteristic charm. When he saw me, his expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read, not guilt. Exactly, but a careful neutrality that felt more menacing than outright hostility. He nodded in my direction, said good morning in the same tone he'd use with any colleague, and proceeded to his desk as if we'd never shared late-night phone calls or worked side by side on complex cases. The casual dismissal hurt more than anger would have. At least anger would have acknowledged that our relationship had meant something, that its destruction required some emotional investment. Instead, Tyler treated me like a minor inconvenience that had been handled through proper channels. The isolation began immediately and systematically. Conversations that would have naturally included me suddenly shifted when I approached. Not obviously enough to seem intentional, but consistently enough to make me feel like an outsider in my own workplace. During the Tuesday morning team meeting, when Janet asked for updates on current cases, Tyler presented his progress on files I'd helped develop, using language that subtly distanced himself from any collaboration. When she asked about the Morrison account, which we'd worked on together extensively, Tyler explained the status using only singular pronouns, as if I'd played no role in the complex negotiations and analysis that had brought the case to resolution. I sat there taking notes, my pen gripping tighter with each revelation, but I didn't interrupt or correct him. Something told me that any attempt to assert my contributions would only reinforce whatever narrative Tyler had already established about my difficult behavior. The most painful moment came during lunch hour on Wednesday, when I walked into the break room and found myself face to face with Tyler at the coffee machine. For a split second, muscle memory kicked in, and I almost smiled, almost asked how his morning was going, almost fell back into the comfortable routine we'd maintained for months. But Tyler's expressions stopped me cold. He looked at me with the kind of careful politeness reserved for acquaintances you'd rather avoid, poured his coffee, and walked out without saying a word. I stood there staring at the ancient machine, remembering all the times we'd complained about its terrible brew while planning our day's work. The silence in the break room felt deafening, and I realized that some of my other colleagues had witnessed the interaction. When I turned around, they quickly averted their eyes, but I caught the uncomfortable expressions on their faces. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know the details. By Thursday, the professional distance Tyler had created between us became a chasm that affected every aspect of my work life. Files that had always been reviewed collaboratively were now handled separately, with Tyler taking the lead on higher profile cases, while I was relegated to routine processing tasks. When clients called asking for updates on cases we'd worked on together, Tyler fielded the calls independently, never consulting with me or acknowledging my previous involvement. I watched him build relationships with Janet and the regional team that excluded me entirely, presenting himself as the go-to person for complex claims while positioning me as someone who handled basic administrative functions. The transformation was so complete that I began to question my own memories of our partnership, wondering if I'd imagined the collaborative dynamic we'd once shared. The breaking point came Friday afternoon when I overheard Tyler talking to Derek from accounting near the copy machine. They were discussing weekend plans, something about a basketball game, when Derek mentioned how stressed everyone seemed lately. Tyler's response hit me like a physical blow. He said something about how some people just couldn't handle the pressure of a competitive work environment, how it was unfortunate when personal issues started affecting professional performance. The way he said it, with that concerned tone that suggested he was really worried about someone's well-being, made it clear he was talking about me. Derek nodded sympathetically, and Tyler continued, explaining how important it was to maintain professional boundaries and not let workplace relationships become too personal or complicated. I stood frozen behind the filing cabinet, listening to Tyler rewrite our entire professional history as a cautionary tale about the dangers of getting too emotionally invested in work partnerships. The weekend stretched endlessly as I replayed every moment of the past week, analyzing each interaction for signs of the conspiracy I now knew existed against me. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, half expecting another call from HR or a message from Janet about my performance. The apartment that had always been my refuge felt claustrophobic, filled with reminders of the job that had once given my life structure and purpose. I thought about the 6 years I'd invested in that company, the expertise I'd developed, the relationships I'd built with clients and colleagues. All of it felt tainted now, poisoned by Tyler's systematic campaign to discredit me. But the worst part wasn't the professional betrayal, it was the way he'd made me complicit in my own destruction. Every time I'd defended him, every mistake I'd covered for him, every piece of knowledge I'd shared had been turned into ammunition for this attack. I'd handed him the tools to destroy me, and I'd done it willingly, enthusiastically, believing that we were building something together when he was actually tearing me down. The call came on a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 3 weeks after my meeting with Linda from HR. I was at my desk reviewing the Patterson claim file when my phone rang with Janet's extension. Her voice sounded different from usual, more formal, lacking the casual warmth that had characterized our interactions over the years. She asked if I could come to her office for a brief meeting, and something in her tone made my stomach drop. I'd been expecting this moment since that Friday afternoon when I'd overheard Tyler's carefully crafted character assassination, but the reality of it still hit me like a punch to the chest. I saved my work, straightened my jacket, and walked the 20 feet to Janet's office, knowing that this conversation would end my career at the company, where I'd invested 6 years of my professional life. Janet's office had always felt welcoming before, with family photos on her desk and plants that actually thrived under her care. But that morning it felt like a courtroom. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, the same chair where I'd received positive performance reviews and discussed career development plans. This time, though, there was a manila folder between us, official-looking documents that I knew contained my professional death sentence. Janet opened the folder with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this before, her expression carefully neutral as she began reading from what was obviously a prepared script. She explained that the company had completed its review of recent workplace concerns and had determined that it would be best for everyone involved if we parted ways. The phrase "parted ways" hung in the air like something toxic, a euphemism designed to make my termination sound mutual when we both knew exactly what was happening. The reasons Janet cited were so sanitized and corporate that they barely resembled the complex reality of my situation with Tyler. She mentioned concerns about team dynamics, difficulties with collaborative work styles, and the need for employees who could adapt to changing professional environments. Everything was framed in language that suggested mutual responsibility for failed relationships, as if Tyler and I had simply been incompatible colleagues who couldn't find a way to work together effectively. There was no mention of the false accusations, no acknowledgement of the systematic campaign had led to this moment, no recognition of my 6 years of dedicated service to the company. Janet spoke as if she were discussing a minor personnel adjustment rather than destroying someone's career based on manufactured evidence from a manipulative colleague. When I tried to defend myself, to explain what had really happened between Tyler and me, Janet's expression shifted to something that looked almost sympathetic, but felt completely dismissive. She said she understood that workplace conflicts could be stressful and that sometimes perspectives on events could differ significantly between the people involved. The implication was clear. My version of events was just one subjective interpretation of a complex situation, no more valid than Tyler's carefully documented complaints. When I mentioned specific instances where Tyler had taken credit for my work or excluded me from important communications, Janet nodded politely but offered no real response. She'd already made her decision based on Tyler's evidence, and nothing I said would change the outcome. The meeting wasn't a discussion or an investigation. It was a formality designed to provide legal cover for a predetermined conclusion. The logistics of my departure were handled with brutal efficiency. Janet explained that my last day would be that Friday, giving me just 3 days to wrap up my current cases and transition my responsibilities to other team members. She handed me a separation agreement that outlined my severance package and the terms of my departure, including a non-disclosure clause that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of my termination with former colleagues or future employers. The document was thick with legal language, but the message was simple: take the money, keep quiet, and disappear without causing any trouble for the company. There would be no opportunity to clear my name, no chance to present my side of the story to the people who'd worked with me for years. Tyler's narrative would become the official version of events, unchallenged and unchallenged. The most humiliating part of the entire process was Janet's suggestion that I consider this an opportunity for professional growth and new challenges. She spoke about how sometimes a change of environment could help people discover new strengths and develop different skill sets, as if being forced out of my job was actually a favor the company was doing for me. Her tone was encouraging, even inspirational, completely disconnected from the reality that my career was being destroyed, based on lies told by someone I'd trusted completely. When she offered to provide a neutral reference for future job searches, emphasizing that she'd focus on my technical skills rather than any interpersonal challenges, I realized how thoroughly my professional reputation had been sanitized and minimized. I wouldn't just be leaving this job, I'd be starting over with a damaged reputation, and no way to explain what had really happened. As I walked back to my desk for what I now knew were my final days at the company, I felt a strange combination of relief and devastation. The uncertainty was over, the waiting was finished, but the injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. Tyler had won completely, not just taking credit for my work or marginalizing my contributions, but actually succeeding in having me removed from the company entirely. He'd identified me as a threat to his advancement, and had systematically eliminated that threat, using my own trust and loyalty against me. The 3 days I had left weren't enough time to defend myself or expose his manipulation. They were just enough time to pack up my personal belongings and pretend that my departure was voluntary. I sat down at my computer and stared at the screen, knowing that Tyler was probably somewhere in the building, continuing his workday as if nothing significant had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed someone's career with surgical precision. The worst part was knowing that he probably convinced himself that I deserved it, that removing a difficult colleague had been a necessary step in his professional development. The first week after leaving the company felt like falling through space without a parachute, every morning bringing the disorienting realization that I had nowhere to go, and nothing that required my immediate attention. I'd wake up at 6:30 out of habit, shower and dress as if I was still reporting to an office, then sit at my kitchen table with coffee that tasted like disappointment, and stare at job search websites until my eyes burned. The apartment that had always been my sanctuary now felt like a prison, every corner reminding me of the professional identity I'd lost. The framed certificates on my wall mocked me with their promises of expertise and achievement, credentials that felt worthless now that Tyler had successfully rewritten my professional narrative. I'd built my entire sense of self around being competent, reliable, trustworthy in a work environment. And without that structure, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. The isolation was more complete than I'd anticipated, cutting deeper than just the loss of daily workplace interactions. Friends who'd primarily been work colleagues had already begun to distance themselves, either because they'd heard Tyler's version of events, or because associating with someone who'd been terminated for interpersonal difficulties felt risky to their own careers. The few former colleagues who reached out did so carefully, with neutral messages about staying in touch that felt more like polite formalities than genuine expressions of friendship. I realized how much of my social life had been built around shared professional experiences, conversations about cases and clients and office politics that no longer included me. The network I'd spent 6 years developing had evaporated overnight, leaving me professionally isolated in a way that made job searching feel almost impossible. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, though it was the way I'd started to internalize Tyler's narrative about my behavior and capabilities. Late at night, lying in bed and replaying every interaction we'd had, I found myself wondering if I really had been difficult to work with, if my enthusiasm for our partnership had actually been possessiveness, if my desire to protect him from his mistakes had really been an attempt to control his career. The doubt was insidious, creeping into my self-perception until I questioned every professional relationship I'd ever had. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I didn't understand appropriate workplace boundaries. Maybe my 6 years of positive performance reviews had been charity, rather than recognition of genuine competence. Tyler's manipulation had been so thorough that he'd managed to make me complicit in my own self-destruction, even after he was no longer in my life. The financial pressure added another layer of stress that made clear thinking almost impossible. The severance package would last a few months if I was careful, but the job market in Phoenix was competitive, and my sudden departure from my previous position raised questions I couldn't answer honestly without violating the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed. Interview after interview ended with polite rejections, often after conversations that felt like subtle interrogations about my reasons for leaving such a stable position. I learned to craft vague explanations about seeking new challenges and professional growth, but potential employers seemed to sense that something was missing from my story. The longer my unemployment stretched, the more desperate I became, and that desperation showed in interviews, creating a cycle of rejection that reinforced my growing belief that Tyler had been right about my professional limitations. My sister finally intervened after I'd spent 3 weeks, barely leaving the apartment except for grocery runs and job interviews that went nowhere. She showed up unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, took one look at my disheveled appearance and the pile of rejection emails on my laptop screen, and insisted on taking me out for coffee. sitting in a diner booth across from someone who'd known me since childhood. I tried to explain what had happened at work, without breaking the confidentiality agreement that legally bound me to silence. But even the sanitized version I could share sounded pathetic. A middle-aged woman who couldn't handle working with a younger colleague. Someone who'd let workplace dynamics become personal and complicated. My sister listened with the kind of patience that comes from genuine love, but I could see the confusion in her eyes as she tried to reconcile the confident professional she'd always known with the broken person sitting across from her. The turning point came during a particularly brutal job interview at a competing insurance company, where the hiring manager asked pointed questions about my departure from my previous position and my ability to work effectively in team environments. Something about his tone, the assumption that I was damaged goods who needed to prove my worthiness for basic employment, triggered a flash of the anger I'd been suppressing for months. For the first time since Tyler's betrayal, I felt something other than self-doubt and despair. I realized that I'd been carrying Tyler's version of events like a weight on my shoulders, allowing his lies to define my sense of professional worth. The truth was that I'd been an effective, dedicated employee whose only mistake had been trusting someone who saw kindness as weakness and loyalty as an opportunity for exploitation. I didn't get that job, but walking out of that office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the beginning of my own voice returning. That night, I sat down and wrote out everything that had happened with Tyler. Not for any legal purpose or professional vindication, but just to reclaim my own narrative from the distortions he'd created. I wrote about the late-night phone calls where I'd patiently explained procedures to someone who'd eventually use that knowledge to marginalize me. I wrote about covering for his mistakes and defending his work, about the partnership I'd believed in and the systematic way he'd erased my contributions from our shared successes. I wrote about the HR meeting where his carefully constructed lies had been presented as objective truth, and the termination meeting where 6 years of dedicated service had been reduced to corporate euphemisms about team dynamics. Writing it all down didn't change what had happened, but it helped me separate Tyler's manipulative narrative from the reality of my own experience. For the first time in months, I remembered who I'd been before Tyler had convinced me I was someone else entirely. 6 months later, sitting in my new office at a smaller firm across town, I can finally see Tyler's betrayal for what it was, a masterclass in workplace manipulation that taught me more about human nature than any business school course ever could. The new job pays less and offers fewer advancement opportunities, but it came with something invaluable: colleagues who collaborate honestly, and supervisors who judge performance based on actual work rather than office politics. I've learned to recognize the warning signs I missed with Tyler, the subtle credit taking, the strategic positioning, the way some people use vulnerability as a weapon against those generous enough to offer help. Trust, I now understand, isn't something you give away freely in professional environments. It's something you build carefully, with clear boundaries and documented contributions, never allowing kindness to become a substitute for self-protection. The most painful lesson was learning that loyalty in the workplace is often a one-way street, especially for people like me who were raised to believe that hard work and good intentions automatically earn respect and reciprocity. Tyler had identified my willingness to sacrifice my own interests for the team as a weakness he could exploit. And he'd been right. Every time I'd covered for his mistakes, every late-night phone call where I'd shared my expertise, every moment I'd defended him in meetings had been an investment in my own destruction. I'd confused being needed with being valued, mistaking Tyler's dependency on my knowledge for genuine partnership. The truth was that I'd been useful to him, nothing more, and once he'd extracted everything valuable from our relationship, discarding me had been as easy as deleting an old email. Looking back now, I can see how Tyler had systematically positioned himself as the rising star, while casting me as the helpful but ultimately expendable support staff. He'd learned to speak the language of corporate advancement, taking credit confidently, positioning failures as learning experiences, building relationships with decision-makers, while maintaining just enough distance from daily operational work to avoid being associated with mundane tasks. Meanwhile, I'd remained focused on doing excellent work, believing that competence would speak for itself and that my contributions would be recognized naturally. I'd been playing by rules that no longer existed in modern corporate environments, where perception often matters more than performance and where narrative, construction can be more valuable than actual achievement. The hardest part of rebuilding my career has been learning to advocate for myself in ways that feel fundamentally uncomfortable, but are absolutely necessary for professional survival. I document my contributions meticulously now, sending follow-up emails after meetings to confirm my role in decisions and copying supervisors on communications that demonstrate my expertise. I've learned to interrupt when colleagues try to speak over me, to correct misattributions of my work immediately, rather than hoping the truth will eventually surface, and to build relationships with management that don't depend on other people's willingness to share credit. These behaviors feel aggressive and self-serving to someone who was raised to be modest and collaborative, but I've come to understand them as basic professional self-defense. The Tyler experience taught me that some people view kindness as weakness and generosity as opportunity, but it also revealed something important about my own values and boundaries. I refused to become cynical or manipulative in response to his betrayal, because that would mean letting him destroy not just my career, but my character as well. Instead, I've learned to be strategically generous, helpful to colleagues who demonstrate reciprocity, protective of my expertise until trust is earned, and willing to collaborate without surrendering my individual identity to team dynamics. I still believe in mentoring younger colleagues and sharing institutional knowledge, but I do it now with clear expectations about credit and recognition, documented contributions, and mutual accountability. Perhaps the most valuable insight from my experience with Tyler is understanding how workplace betrayal often reveals systemic problems that extend far beyond individual bad actors. The company that terminated me based on his fabricated complaints had created an environment where manipulation could flourish because they prioritized conflict avoidance over truth-seeking. They'd rather eliminate someone perceived as difficult than investigate the actual dynamics that had led to workplace tension. HR departments and management structures that rely on he said, she said narratives without examining patterns of behavior or seeking corroborating evidence essentially reward the most convincing liars while punishing their victims. Tyler succeeded not just because he was a skilled manipulator, but because he operated in a system that made his tactics viable and profitable. The woman I am now would handle Tyler very differently than the woman I was 18 months ago. I would document every collaboration from the beginning, maintain professional boundaries even when building working relationships, and refuse to cover for colleagues' mistakes regardless of the personal cost to them. I would challenge credit misattribution immediately and publicly, build independent relationships with supervisors and clients, and never allow my professional identity to become entangled with someone else's success or failure. Most importantly, I would trust my instincts when someone's behavior feels off, even if I couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. The uncomfortable feeling I'd dismissed during Tyler's subtle turn had been my subconscious recognizing patterns my conscious mind wasn't ready to accept. That inner voice, I've learned, is often the first line of defense against people who see your strengths as vulnerabilities they can exploit. Tyler took credit for my work, destroyed my reputation, and cost me a job I'd loved. But he also taught me lessons about professional survival that will protect me for the rest of my career. In a strange way, I'm almost grateful for the education, even though I wouldn't wish the tuition I paid on anyone else. If my story resonates with you, if you felt that sinking feeling of being used by someone you trusted, then you need to hear more stories like this. You need to understand the patterns, the warning signs, the strategies that people like Tyler use to climb over good people like us. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because I'm going to keep sharing what I've learned about surviving and thriving in workplace environments where not everyone has good intentions. Your career is too important to leave to chance, and your trust is too valuable to give to people who haven't earned it.